Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's very special session on neurodiversity from the inside out, the future of our children. My name is Uzma Akser, and I'm thrilled to be your host for this important conversation. Today, we dive into a topic that is close to my heart and many others. How can we create a world that not only understands but truly embraces neurodiversity? To guide us through this conversation, we're incredibly fortunate to have with us Dr. Stephen Shaw. Diagnosed with atypical development and strong autistic tendencies, and too sick for outpatient treatment, Dr. Shaw was recommended for institutionalization. Dr. Stephen Shaw was non-speaking until 4, and with much support from his parents, teachers, wife, and others, he is now a full-time professor at Adelphi University. Dr. Stephen Shaw is an international renowned educator, consultant, and author on lifespan issues pertinent to education, relationships, employment, and self-advocacy. Dr. Stephen Shaw also serves on the boards of numerous autism-related organizations like Autism Society. Dr. Stephen Shaw combines personal, practical, and academic experiences to promote fulfilling and productive lives for autistic and otherwise neurodivergent individuals as a rule rather than the exception. We're so grateful for your insights and look forward to learning from your experiences and perspectives today.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So without further ado, let's dive in.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today.
You're welcome. We're super excited. I remember meeting you a few years ago in Dubai, and honestly, it's a pleasure to have you again on this platform and connect and really share your insights. So let's move on to our first question. I mean, really, for me, it's just important for you to highlight to our audience about your journey.
Oh, certainly. So to put it briefly, things were pretty typical for the first 18 months when I was then struck with what I call the regressive autism bomb. And like what happens to about 30% of us autistic individuals, I lost functional communication, had meltdowns, withdrew from the environment. In a brief, I became a very autistic little kid. There was so little known about autism that it took my parents a whole year to find a place for diagnosis. And when they did, now I'm 2.5, the doctors said, well, we've never seen such a sick child, send him off to an institution. And that was the prognosis for somebody diagnosed as autistic at that time. Fortunately, my parents, like we're seeing ever increasing numbers of parents around the globe, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in the United Arab Emirates, in China, in Russia, everywhere, parents are advocating for their children. And my parents convinced the doctors to take me in about a year. However, it was during that year that my parents had to implement what we would today refer to as an intensive home-based early intervention program. And this was a program that emphasized music, movement, sensory integration, narration, and imitation. And that's just today's terminology, because in those days, the concept of early intervention didn't even exist. So what did they do? Well, first they tried to get me to imitate them. Imitation is a time-honored teaching strategy. Every parent has done it. Actually, everyone has used imitation, has shown somebody how to do something with the hope that they'll see how to do it and they'll be able to do it on their own. However, perhaps due to a difference in mirror neurons, it didn't work for me, and that doesn't work for many autistic people. So my parents flipped it around and imitated me. And once they did that, I became aware of them in my environment, and they were able to move me along. And I believe the key implication is that first you have to establish a connection with an autistic person. And then once you establish that connection, that is the foundation for establishing a trusting relationship. And only when those two prerequisites are met can you do meaningful work with an autistic person. And I believe that holds true for everybody else as well, not just autistic people. And so my parents were able to get it so that I could, speech started to return at age 4 with the efforts of my parents. And then I entered the school that initially rejected me. I got reevaluated. Instead of being considered as psychotic and ready for an institution, I got upgraded to neurotic, so things are looking better in the world. Often we hear about the various interests and sometimes significant strengths that autistic people have. And for me, my first interest was disassembling watches. So there I am at age 4. I was found by my parents taking apart a watch with a knife. I'd pop open the back, extract the motor, remove some of the gears, spin them around, and put it all back together again. The watch still worked, and there weren't any pieces left over. So my parents, instead of staring at the closed door of disability, disorder, and deficit, and focusing on what I couldn't do, they focused on what I could do, and soon provided all kinds of other devices to take apart and to put back together again. So that's a real early example of one focusing on strengths, focusing on abilities. And also, it's important to notice these abilities because it is these strengths that will so often lead to success later on in life as perhaps a hobby or perhaps even a vocation. So at that time, maybe it looked like I could have been a watch repairman. I would have needed a lot of support and communication and everything else that you need to live as an adult, but at least that was something I could do. And had my trajectory gone in that direction. So then we moved to regular school kindergarten at age 6, where I was a social and academic catastrophe. You know what happens to people who are different in grade school? Fortunately, school systems realize that bullying is not a developmental phase that people need to go through, but something really needs to be done about it. Academically, I was usually about a grade behind in most of my subjects. I would spend most of my elementary school days reading my favorite books that I got from the library. I get all the books on, for example, astronomy, weather, electronics, volcanoes, dinosaurs, earthquakes, aviation, space exploration, music. And I'd read them all, take notes, copy diagrams, and then put them all back and get books on some other subject. And this was something I really enjoyed. However, at the same time, I also wondered, is there something else I should be doing in school, such as doing math in groups or reading in groups with my classmates, even though I was happy to read my books. And I think what that translated to is that teachers didn't quite know how to reach me, but at the same time, since I wasn't a behavior problem, they just left me to my own devices. And it was probably for better rather than for worse, because they knew so little about autism in those days. So we zoom up to middle and high school. You don't need to be autistic to have difficulties in middle and high school. However, for me, it was easier for 2 main reasons. One, I figured out that using words instead of sound effects from the environment really helped with social interaction. And then 2, I was able to engage in my highly focused interest of music. I joined the band. And now I had a structured activity in which to mediate my interactions with others. And in fact, I got so caught up with music that I got it into my head that I needed to learn how to play all the instruments. So there I was, spending hours in the instrument closet, disassembling instruments, sometimes combining a number of instruments into these horrific contraptions that never should have seen the light of day. And then when I heard that one of the requirements for a degree in music education was that you had to learn all the instruments, well, then that seemed to be the thing to do. Well, I didn't learn them all while I was in high school, but I did get it up to about 15. So then it's off to college. College was a utopia. More friends, no more bullies. If I wanted to ride my bicycle at midnight, I could find someone just as strange as I was to also ride at midnight. Bicycles had also become a special interest, and I got it to where I could take a bicycle apart down to the ball bearings and then put that back together again. And it worked, and there were no pieces left over. So maybe at this time, had my trajectory gone differently, I would still be a bicycle mechanic, because that was a great job and to earn money in high school and college, and perhaps managing or owning a bicycle shop at this time. So in college, I studied music from bachelor all the way through my doctorate. And then after I finished my doctoral coursework in music, I started getting more interested in autism and special education. So I defected to the School of Education and got my doctorate in special education. And so at this time, while I was working on my doctorate, I wrote a few books, such as Beyond the Wall, Personal Experiences with Autism and Asperger's Syndrome. That's my autobiography. Another book on self-advocacy for autistic people, and also co-authoring Understanding Autism for Dummies. I also began giving presentations around the world talking about autism. And to this point, I've traveled to 58 countries talking about autism. And this summer, I expect to present at a conference in Kenya, and that will bring the number up to 59.
Amazing.
So now I spend my time either teaching and researching on issues related to autism at my university, Adelphi University to be specific, traveling around the world, sometimes as often as 2 different countries a month to talk about autism, writing books and articles on autism, and finally giving music lessons to autistic individuals. And here I am talking to you.
Amazing. What a wonderful, wonderful journey. And really, we're very lucky to have you here today. And it's just a pleasure to hear your story. And it reassures many parents, because you highlighting the passion, the interest that you had in a certain topic has led you to where you are today. And I often believe if we spend that time with our children and connect with them and understand what their passions are, we can truly make a difference. That's very similar to my own experience actually at home with my 14-year-old. He loves computers, absolutely mesmerized by the parts that are inside a PC. And he said to me when he was I think he was 9 or 10, I want to build my own PC. And I'm like, oh, hold on. And we said, can you wait a little while? He said, but I know what goes into a PC. And we kind of took our time to buy the parts, I guess. But what we did in the process was to get him to research what goes into a PC, the names of the parts, for example, the pricing of each part, how to put it together. So researching how to assemble everything. And by the time he was 11, he'd built his own PC. And from scratch, right? And that was amazing to see, and really, it gives us hope that if we go with our children's passion, we can really make a huge difference. And here you are as a true example for that. So that really reassures many families around the world who are watching this today.
All the autistic people I know who are successful have found a way to parlay their passion and interest and strengths into something that's valued by the world. And usually that means that translates to some sort of employment. Electronics was also a fascination of mine. And there I was taking apart radios and TVs and other electronic and electric devices, and had computers at that time grown out of the stage of being confined to these huge rooms that were specially air conditioned and so on, then maybe I would have been taking apart computers too.
Yeah, absolutely. But we need you here today as an advocate, don't we?
Well, it's great and
Yeah,
an honor to be an advocate.
absolutely. So it takes me on to my next question, actually. The framework, the 4A framework, what does it stand for?
Well, those 4As are, I believe, are a great way to think about autism and supporting autistic individuals in a neuro-affirming manner. So let's go through these 4As.
Sure.
The first A is awareness. And we've been at awareness for at least 2 generations. So back when I was in school, autism was considered to be this rare psychiatric condition caused by poor parenting. The parents were blamed, usually the mother. Fortunately, we know a lot better now. And we know that there's nothing parents could do to cause or prevent autism. And that we still don't have a firm grasp, or really any grasp, on the causes of autism. The best minds in research believe it starts with a genetic predisposition, which then gets triggered by, we're not quite too sure what the something else is that triggers the autism. So now as a society, in the United States, we recognize that autism occurs in 1 in 36 people. That's almost 3%. That's a lot of autism. And what that suggests to educators is that if you don't have an autistic child in this classroom, the numbers will catch up with you and you'll have an autistic child in the next classroom.
Yeah.
We're also much better at recognizing autism, whether it's at home, in education, in the community, or employment, and increasing numbers of autistic individuals reading about autism, usually on the internet, and saying, gee whiz, I think this is me, and then getting their suspicions more often than not confirmed by more formal diagnostic procedures. And as I'm talking about autism now, this also can be generalized to the neurodivergent population. So those individuals who are maybe diagnosed with ADHD, dyslexia, and various other learning differences, we have this great category of neurodivergent where we're all kind of housed together. So it's all this awareness that builds a solid foundation for step number 2, which is acceptance. And acceptance is turning away from trying to cure, eliminate, make the autistic or otherwise neurodivergent individual more like a non-neurodivergent individual, like a typical individual. And an example might be in a classroom, let's say we have a grade school child not interested in doing math. Maybe they're not good at it. And there's really been no way to get that child motivated to do mathematics. So what that would suggest is, what often happens is that an interest inventory will be taken on the child. Oh, we found the child is interested in, let's say, using computerized flight simulators. That's identified as a powerful reinforcer. And now in order to regain access to that interest, to that activity that that child lives for, now you have to meet your goals in mathematics before you can use the computerized flight simulator, as it serves as a reinforcer. However, that's kind of a negative way of going about it. It's working against the characteristics of autism. Acceptance is understanding the characteristics of autism, one of them being highly focused interests. And the educator who is accepting of the autistic or otherwise neurodivergent individual will now find a way to teach mathematics using a computerized flight simulator. There's a lot of mathematics involved in flying an airplane. And now mathematics will become intrinsically reinforcing.
Yeah.
So it's not a case of doing this thing you don't like, a non-preferred activity, so that you can access the preferred activity, but more like, well, this math involves airplanes, so now I'm into it. And eventually the child will figure out that they can get better at using the flight simulator if they know mathematics. So then we get to the third stage, and that is appreciation. And that is where autistic and otherwise neurodivergent individuals are valued for who we are and what we can contribute to society. So we're recognizing and celebrating the strengths of neurodivergent individuals. And we first started seeing this in the large IT companies, Google, Microsoft, Apple, SAP, and others, actively seeking autistic individuals because they know a certain number of us can engage in computerized geekery at levels that nobody else can. And my thought is that this is great. This is a wonderful thing to be doing. And in fact, I've worked with SAP to help train young adults interested in IT. The young adults certainly didn't need to learn anything more about IT from me. But my colleague, Dr. Robert Nassif, and I were charged with teaching them what we call the soft skills for employment. All the other skills that you need in order to find and keep a job. However, my question always is, as we're considering high-level autistic computerized geekery, is what about everybody else? Because computerized geekery occurs in a small subset of autistic people. It's a small minority, big enough for these companies to notice, but certainly a majority of autistic people are into other things. So what about autistic people who are involved in the arts, for example, or literature, or physical education? And also, what about those autistic individuals who need more support? The individual, for example, who needs support in communication, social interaction, and even transportation to wherever they're going, managing their schedule. And to this end, I know of an autistic person. He lives in Florida, and he loves to do nothing more than to fold laundry perfectly after it comes out of a dryer. Maybe it's the creases, maybe it's the sense of order, whatever it is. We don't actually have to know, but it's something that he likes.
Absolutely.
And I know that he would be on the first plane out to the UK to help you or anybody else in the UK who would like assistance with their laundry. However, you'd have to pay him to do it.
Yeah.
Because that is his job. He spends all day in a laundromat pulling laundry out of a hot dryer, folding and sorting perfectly, better and faster and with more enthusiasm than anybody else. And now we get to the last and the fourth step, which is action. And those are the concrete steps. The action represents the efforts that we put into recognizing the strengths of autistic individuals and finding a way to employ those strengths to lead fulfilling and productive lives.
Wow. Oh, the example of your friend, showing passion and interest in a particular area is fascinating, because my question now here is, how do we create inclusive workplaces for individuals who have a passion and want to, go out to work, build a career, enter the workplace, but I find a lot of organizations struggling to support neurodivergent individuals?
I believe that it first starts with recognizing what the strengths and the interests are. And so, for example, this is a story from my own experience. As a teenager, my first formal job was cleaning tables in a noisy, busy, sensory overloading restaurant.
Yeah.
And I knew that it didn't work. And I'd have to do something else. So I thought, okay, so what am I good at? What do I like to do? Taking apart bicycles. Well, that's something that can translate into bicycle repair. So I got on my bicycle that I built from the ground up. I made the rounds of all the bicycle shops in the area, and I would locate the manager or supervisor and begin to nerd into my bicycle with that person at a level that only someone who is a bicycle aficionado or perhaps a manager of a bicycle shop could understand and talk about. And then after a period of time, I'd ask him for a job. It took 12 times, but eventually I found a job fixing bicycles where I could manage my sensory input by staying in the back of the shop fixing bicycles, or I could come out to the front of the shop to perseverate on bicycles on whoever walked in. And I think the manager referred to that as selling bicycles. So what I realized that I had done, and it was only many years after, was using what is known as the portfolio method. So getting away of looking for a job. So getting away from the traditional interview process, which is riddled with incredible amounts of hidden curriculum, unspoken rules, and things that autistic people just have such great difficulty with. And it's a case of how much time do you put into helping a person to try to do something where they probably won't be successful, to focusing on the strengths and the abilities. So I sold my work, I sold my bicycle repair knowledge to the supervisor. And by the time I asked him for a job, he already knew I understood my way around bicycles. And as we go to IT with SAP in particular, after my colleague and I put 24 young adults through our educational process of soft skills and employment, the SAP did not have traditional interviews, but rather they asked all the candidates to assemble a Lego robot. And then they would watch the candidates assemble the robots, take notes. And for example, if somebody was one of the first to finish, what did they do then? Did they go help a classmate finish their robot? If they did, that's an indication that that person is helpful, and that's a good prognostic sign for successful employment. And then after that, after the robots were assembled, they had a pizza party and they talked about the job. They were expecting to hire half of the students, about 12, but they ended up hiring every single one. And many years later, they were all still working there, except for one who had moved across the country. And that's another autistic characteristic, that being routine. We like our routines, and I have yet to meet an employer who does not like it when their employee shows up to work on time every single day. Now, as we look at supporting autistic and otherwise neurodivergent individuals in employment, a lot of it focuses on understanding the individual by the employer, and also developing, or possibly needing to develop, some easy accommodations, simple accommodations for that individual. And accommodations might be something like presenting information in written form as opposed to, or I should say, or in addition to verbal form. Perhaps having a manual that focuses on the job that needs to be done. Recognizing that people who are neurodivergent might communicate differently. And what I've found after working with employers is commonly they'll say, and this works for teachers too, is they'll often say, all the work that I've done in better understanding my autistic or otherwise neurodivergent employees, developing strategies and accommodations has made me better at being a supervisor or an educator overall.
Yeah.
So everybody benefits. If we look at, for example, environmental considerations, many autistic people are light sensitive. Many autistic people perceive fluorescent lights like most people perceive a strobe light. Not much work is going to get done in a room lit with a strobe light. As for myself, while I don't like fluorescent lights, I don't perceive them as a strobe light. But for me, well, let's just say many people may think this hat's a fashion statement, and certainly it's always good to support my university, Adelphi University, whenever possible. But in reality, it's an accommodation. Because for me, being under recessed lighting fixtures is probably like looking into a spotlight for most other people. So the employer who is aware of this, who can modify the lighting, maybe switch to a different type of lighting, lights where instead of having a light bulb hanging from the ceiling, let's find a shade to put over that light bulb, or use indirect lighting. And what will happen is, in addition to anybody who is light sensitive benefiting, everybody else will benefit from better lighting as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, these are really important, examples to share, because I often have organizations coming to us for training. And I mean, it's been a brilliant experience, and I'm not going to lie. We've had some companies saying, well, we're doing this already. We are supporting our neurodivergent employees. We're, supporting them with the noise cancelling headsets, for example, the lighting, the seating arrangement. We are doing that. But what else? I mean, my question here is, I guess I want to dig a little deeper today, is what else can employers do when a neurodivergent individual's needs are being met, but then it's that extra layer where it might not just be the noise, it might not just be the lighting or the layout of the room. There's the emotions, right? The feelings, the anxiety.
Right. And so for this, now you're talking about the social interaction piece.
Mm-hmm.
And making it easier for autistic or neurodivergent people to socially interact. So, for example, an autistic's nightmare is the holiday office party at the end of the year, where it's noisy. There's a lot going on, a lot of commotion, and maybe just too much for an autistic person. So instead of having a spoken or even unspoken requirement that everybody goes to the office party, everybody goes to the bar on Friday after work to enjoy themselves, there'll be some people, and some of them will also not be autistic and not neurodivergent, but just prefer a different way of socially interacting. So might it be possible to find alternatives to a loud, noisy, crowded office party? And what strategies, if it can't be avoided, what strategies can we provide for the autistic individual? Such as, I often use this one, come early and leave early.
Mm-hmm.
If you have to show FaceTime like that, do we always have to meet in a noisy bar? Might there be other places we can meet on Friday if that's the culture of the company, to all get together on Friday and talk about the week and get kind of drunk and be noisy? Most people like that, but that can be very difficult for autistic individuals. Also, understanding the autistic person's literalness, which can make it difficult to interpret jokes, idioms, such as the lunch hour.
Yeah.
How many people actually take a whole hour for lunch? And then what do you do as the supervisor who is questioned by the autistic or otherwise neurodivergent individual? Well, I have lunch hour here, but it's only 45 minutes. So what is that? That's not right. And explaining to the autistic individual that it's kind of an idiom or a term, and hour doesn't necessarily mean a full 60 minutes. So that's just one example. Casual Fridays. You don't need to be autistic to have difficulties with that, because there often isn't clear direction or specifications as to exactly what is casual. So if those specifications can be made, maybe jeans are acceptable on Friday, maybe they're not. So let's just say it. And let's talk about what is acceptable. Chino pants, for example. Okay, if that's what the company chooses, then that's fine. Casual footwear, what does that mean? Could that mean sneakers, sandals? Do you need to wear socks? Can you have bare toes? Little things like that. If the company is clearer on these definitions and instructions, in addition to the autistic and neurodivergent employees benefiting, everybody else will benefit as well.
Absolutely. And the two things that come to my mind here, Dr. Stephen Shaw, are one, meet the person where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one, visuals. I mean, would that not help the organization? Like you mentioned, the casual Friday, for example, dressing in a certain way, but having those visuals to support them to understand, okay, this is what I can wear. I have options. And if I have another one is a buddy, a mentor work. So if you have these office parties, you could have a mentor that you can take with you.
Yeah, having a buddy or a friend to take to these social events can be extremely helpful, and also to help decode the vast amount of hidden curriculum or unspoken rules that exist in a workplace. The workplace has a cafeteria where everybody goes to. There are rules as to who you sit next to, and who you don't sit next to. And nobody probably talks about these things, but the autistic person may need to have a discussion about them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what about meeting that individual where they're at? So if an employer, and another thing, actually, I feel there's that little bit of a fear, so to speak, when an employer wants to support, but doesn't know how to support. How do we overcome that challenge at work?
Yeah, well, the good news is that autistic and otherwise neurodivergent people can communicate. And that leads into self-advocacy.
Yeah.
So the employer can just plain out ask, what is helpful? And sometimes the questions may need to be more specific.
Yeah.
So instead of asking what is helpful, because that requires a lot of thought on the autistic person as to, well, what is helpful? But being sensitive and noting that the person may be having difficulty with a particular type of lighting. So is there something we can do with the lighting? And for the autistic person, it might be advocating in a way that the other person can understand and also provide support.
Yeah.
An example might be a person with visual sensitivities entering an office that's lit with fluorescent lights or down lights, whatever it is, it works against that person's sensitivity. And perhaps that person could, upon noticing this, speak to the supervisor. Gee, I noticed that nobody else is wearing a hat. However, I wonder if it's okay if I wear a hat to work. And so that's the request for accommodation. It's very simple. It takes 1 or 2 sentences. The supervisor can understand. However, when you advocate for yourself, you also have to give a reason. And that's the disclosure piece. And disclosure in this situation, probably I would say these lights are very bright. They give me a headache. They hurt my eyes. And if I can wear a hat, I'll be much more productive for your office. So what I just engaged in was known as a partial disclosure. I didn't talk about autism because that would probably be too much information. It would be distracting. There are other situations where a full disclosure is necessary. But often we can just go directly to the specific aspect of autism or whatever neurodivergency situation the person has and addressing that specific issue.
That's really important. I think that's such a valid point that you've made today, because we often hear, individuals saying, but we're too afraid because we might not get hired.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to tick that box, we don't want to disclose fully what are, if we are on the spectrum, for example, or not, because we might not even be considered for stage 1 of the process, never mind getting into the company. But what you've just mentioned now, the self-advocacy, it's so important. And I think it just gives a lot of our audience today, hope, because we can ask for support without. So that partial disclosure is really, I love what you mentioned. That's so important. And I think that's going to benefit so many people, because that sometimes we take to the next level where we feel like, no, we're not going to get hired. That's it. It's the end of our
Right.
opportunity to get into a company. But just allowing the accommodations, and the challenges that you might be facing, and explaining them in that way that you have today can make a huge difference. That's beautiful.
It can. And what is the foundation of effective self-advocacy is knowing what it means to you, to the individual, to be autistic or otherwise neurodivergent. So one thing that being autistic means to me is those visual sensitivities. Another thing it means to me is difficulty with noisy places such as bars or loud office parties. And once I know these challenges, then I can go about thinking of ways to advocate for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So how can we prepare the younger generation to feel confident in their own skin to do this, to advocate for themselves?
Well, I think it's going through those 4 A's.
Yeah.
And that is being aware of the differences of autism when we see it, and maybe not even talking about it to the 5 or 6-year-old child, but still verbalizing and talking about them. Now, I noticed that yesterday it was really hard for you to wait for the bus. We know that the bus was an hour late, but it was really hard for you to wait, wasn't it? And just have a mild discussion about that and talking about why this might be the case, and that different people's brains are wired differently. And you might find waiting hard, but your sister finds writing neatly hard. And your brother is having a hard time learning to tie his shoes, or whatever it might be. But you don't want to only focus on the challenges. You want to make sure you recognize and emphasize the strengths. However, you're really good at taking apart computers and putting them together, or whatever it might be. And what we're getting into is the beginning stages of disclosing to an autistic or otherwise neurodivergent person that they are autistic or otherwise neurodivergent. And that's the first step in that disclosure piece, which is also important, disclosing to the person.
Yeah.
So they need to know that they have differences, and then also 2, being able to line up those strengths and challenges and look for a strength to accommodate for a challenge.
Yeah.
So if one of us is not neurologically set up to write neatly or fast, is there another way to get those words on paper? Could it be typing? Could it be speech to text? Whatever it might be. And that's the second stage. You find a strength to accommodate for a challenge. And then the third step is what I call non-judgmental comparison, where we look at other people the individual knows look at their strengths, look at their challenges. No one's better than anybody else. And we see that people use their strengths, whatever they are, to lead fulfilling and productive lives. So as the individual becomes more familiar and comfortable with who they are in terms of their strengths and challenges, by the time you get to disclosing the diagnosis, then it just sort of fits in like a puzzle. Oh, so that's what it is.
Yeah, I think that's such an important conversation to have with our children. And
Yes.
how would you, I guess, advise our parents who are watching today how to introduce this topic to their child who is on the spectrum, for example? You've mentioned, I guess, an example of social stories here. How can we introduce that they are, on the spectrum, there is that diagnosis, and they have certain challenges, but they have strengths. And how could they then move forward to, an independent life?
Well, there's two examples that I'll give you for this. The first is there's an increasing amount of media focusing on autism, and I know there's some in the UK. And in fact, I had just finished a round of consulting for a series known as Carl the Collector for PBS, Public Broadcasting System in the United States. And what Carl the Collector is an 80-episode series involving a group of 6 young children, maybe around age 6 or so, who are represented by animals. So Carl, for example, is a raccoon, and he's autistic. We have others, such as Sheldon, who is a beaver, who's you can think of him as a great wingman. He's not autistic, he's not neurodivergent. There's Forrest, who is a squirrel who is neurodivergent, in this case ADHD with a huge H, hyperactive. And so anyways, what we see in this video series, is this group of 6 friends who are all accepting of each other's differences, appreciate the differences. And with each episode, one of the characters has a problem that needs to be resolved. Frequently, it's Carl, who is the lead in the show. One of the first leads in any animation that features an autistic person. Often he has a challenge that his friends help him with, but sometimes one of his friends has a challenge that Carl, in his autistic wisdom, can help them with. So video series such as Carl the Collector, and also the disclosure process that I've developed, which I will now give an example of that I was able to use with a student of mine. So it begins with my teaching a 5.5-year-old autistic boy music. His parents wanted me to give him music lessons. All right, fine, and so I did. And he did very well. His parents, however, refused to use the word autism in the house because they knew with enough intensive activity, we'd early interventionize the Asperger's syndrome right out of him. Well, we fast forward several years later, now he's a teenager, and he still has Asperger's syndrome. And now Asperger's syndrome is referred to as autism spectrum, needing supports at level 1. Well, whatever you want to call it, it's autism. So he still has autism. He's still autistic. And his parents asked me to do the deed of disclosing to him that he's autistic. And since I had worked with him for the better part of a decade, I agreed. So the next lesson, we started out with step 1, which is recognizing those strengths and challenges. We talked about his abilities in music, mathematics, and graphic design. We also talked about his challenges in making friends, penmanship, and physical education. And he got that pretty quick. So we bounced over to step 2. which is comparing strengths and challenges, lining them up, writing the strengths on one side of a piece of paper, the challenges on another. And then we decided that since he was so good at computers, why not just write your papers using a computer instead of writing them by hand? So he understood that pretty well. And then we got to step 3, which is non-judgmental comparison. We looked at his father, we looked at his other family members. Different people have different strengths, different challenges. And we even looked at some superstar models, such as Bill Gates. Many people think that he's autistic, and he seemed to do okay with his computer business. But we don't want to overdo it, because then the person might have a reaction, well, I'll never be Bill Gates. So don't overdo that. And then before presenting the label, I talk about scientists and doctors who study people's characteristics. And your set of characteristics line up with, and here we're talking about autism, line up with autism. And in that way, the disclosure of the label comes only after full knowledge of what it means to be as they are, instead of the other way around, which I see it usually happening. The disclosure of the label, you're autistic, and now the child is scared, frightened, anxious. They don't know what to do with it. And actually, the same thing happens with parents during the diagnostic procedure. And so often the doctor will say, based on the results of our testing, your child exhibits the characteristics of autism. That's a terrible way to present it. What if we flipped it around and said, based on our evaluations, our assessment, we realized that your child has some amazing visual and mechanical skills. And in fact, his visual skills are in the 95th percentile.
Wow.
And so on. We go on with the strengths. And this is how these strengths could be used to be successful. Maybe a child would be interested in this, that, or something else. Or could be a great engineer. And then we also recognize that there are a number of challenges, such as social interaction, facial recognition, whatever it might be, certain types of learning. However, we have years of experience, dozens of years of experience, developing accommodations so that your child can use their strengths in order to accommodate for their challenges. And then, only then, can you get to, and this whole set of characteristics line up with, and then you drop the label in its place, whether it's autism, ADHD, dyslexia, whatever it might be. And I think if more disclosures went that way, then we'd all be much better off.
Wow, such a gentle way of putting that across to any child or any family. That's yeah. I mean, that is just absolutely wonderful to hear. And that would, I can imagine, take away so much the unknown, for an individual or the family, that fear concept. I remember when I was sitting in the room, and the consultant, and he called me in and he showed me the report, and I read through the report, and then he informed me that your child is on the autism spectrum. I mean, for me, it was a different ballgame, I guess, because for me it was a sense of relief because I hadn't had the diagnosis process for many years, although I suspected, but it wasn't an official diagnosis. It was me saying my son is on the autism spectrum thanks to Dr. Google, but I couldn't find the right consultant to kind of, assess and then have this diagnosis. So for me, it was a reassurance. But for many, I can imagine, like you explained, that it's entering this unknown of what are we going to do next with our child? How are we going to carry on living, with this child? It's like there's so much fear and anxiety built on this. But the way you've explained it, it's just so beautiful. I mean, that takes away the fear and gives us hope that our children are going to be okay, and that's a big thing, because us parents, we often worry, and this is going to be a completely different topic now, that what is going to happen to our children when we're gone.
Oh yeah, that's a very important topic. That's a whole nother
absolutely
webinar. And sure, what do we do? What do we do when the parents are no longer able or willing, or whatever it might be, to take care of their child.
Yeah.
And that's a big question. Fortunately, I've been able to develop to such a point where I work as a professor of special education. I can be self-supporting. I'm married and doing a lot of things that people do. However, the autism spectrum is wide. It's incredibly diverse. And we have people, maybe it's not even a spectrum. That doesn't quite do enough for it. I've seen various diagrams that better explain it than a spectrum. And it's a circle with different colors and little dots or indication where that person is in this particular segment of the circle. And I think that explains it better. And it's an incredibly diverse spectrum. And in fact, I wonder if there's more diversity within the autism spectrum than outside of the autism spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can continue this conversation much longer, Dr. Stephen Shaw. I want to take more of your time. I really do, and I have so many more questions to ask you. But I'm conscious. I'm looking at the time now, and I'm really, really conscious of, we've gone over an hour. But
we need another webinar. That's what we need.
We do, and I would love to have you on another webinar. Absolutely, we would be honored to have you. So the one thing I want to ask you before we end is, what is that one thing you hope listeners will take away from this conversation today?
Well, getting back to my previous comments about the incredible diversity that we see in the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
And that is, certainly where all of us autistic people are bound by the characteristics, and I'm not going to say disability or disorder, but difference in communication, social interaction, repetitive motions, otherwise known as stimming behaviors, sensory differences, and so on. You can read down the list. However, the diversity is in how they are expressed. Yeah. Some of us may talk too much. Others haven't quite figured out a reliable means of communication yet. So that's still a difference in communication. So that's why I often say, when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person.
Absolutely. And I use that quote in all my trainings, no exaggeration there. I have a picture of you on a slide and I have your quote. And I say that, and I always explain to them that every individual that you meet is different. And here you go, Dr. Stephen Shaw's mentioned that. So thank you very much. I'm honestly honored, really, to have you here today. We're so grateful for your insights. This conversation wasn't just about awareness. It was about acceptance, appreciation, and action. And it's about ensuring that every individual, regardless of how their brain is wired, has the opportunity to thrive and contribute to the society in meaningful ways. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Dr. Stephen Shaw. And yes, absolutely, we will have you again.
All right.
I'm sure our audience would love that. So absolutely, we'll be inviting you again to another show.
Oh, that'll be great.
Thank you. Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much for your time.
Thank you.